Welcome to Chapter 23. We're going to talk about the United States following the end of World War II. So during this lecture, we're going to talk about the decade following the end of World War II, and it's the beginning of the Cold War, which goes on for quite some time. So we'll keep talking about this, but this is the beginning of that era. If you'll remember, we left off talking about World War II last time we met, and we talked about the end of the war in both the European theater and the Pacific theater, and this is following the end of both of those. And what happened to bring us into this era was the use of atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's how World War II was officially ended between the United States and the Empire of Japan. So this is the fallout from the usage of atomic weapons moving forward. In 1947, the country was celebrating the 160th anniversary of the Constitution. And in order to do that, there were 133 historically important documents that were loaded onto a train called the Freedom Train, and these documents were moved around the country in a 16-month-long tour. And they were being moved around so that people would be able to see them, so that they would be able to understand the sort of democracy that they had been a part of building or that they were currently participating in. And some of the most notable documents that were included on the train were the Mayflower Compact, which, if you've taken U.S. History 1, you'll remember that this is the document that was signed on board the Mayflower before disembarking. And it was essentially the first written form of government in what is now the United States. And what it said basically was that people would agree to have the people rule, have people make decisions. And of course, the Declaration of Independence you're likely familiar with, as well as the Gettysburg Address. But it was documents of this caliber that were on board this train and on display for most of the residents in the United States. And it is notable that the National Archives had included 20th century social legislation, like the 14th and 15th Amendments, which have to do with civil rights, and as well as the Four Freedoms speech and the Wagner Act, which dealt with unions and essentially giving workers more power. But the American Heritage Foundation denied including these documents and said that they were likely to be divisive and not representative of what the country was trying to do by moving these documents related to democracy around the country. So they were removed and not included in the collection, even though they mostly dealt with expansion of rights to even more people. So many people felt that it was wrong to take them off, but others felt that they were trying to avoid political controversy. So one notable achievement for this is that the train and the operators of the train would not allow for segregated viewings, and this actually meant cancellations in the South, in the Deep South. There were the operators of the train would not make separate times for Black Americans and white Americans to board the train to see the documents. And if a state was not in compliance with this, if they were not in favor of allowing both Black and white patrons onto the train at the same time, the train just simply wouldn't stop and nobody would get to see it. So they're trying to look at this new era with some sort of sense of unity and some sense of historical importance about where people were coming from. So what this time frame really brings is what's known as the Cold War. So mostly when people talk about the Cold War, it's the United States versus the Soviet Union. You can see pink and blue. And there were a lot of battles outside of either the United States or the Soviet Union in what are commonly called third world countries. What this means is that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were in charge of them, but they were some sort of third option. And both superpowers following the war wanted access to these so-called third world countries because they wanted the resources that they had, they wanted the people that they had, and they wanted to gain more access to land and trading opportunities. So the United States had this idea that they would be able to contain communism from spreading any further than it already had. This idea of containment will come up over and over again over the next couple decades that we're talking about. And there was this telegram in 1946, the long telegram, and it stated that communism would spread if the United States didn't stop it. And as they were the only other superpower at that point following World War II, they needed to go head to head with the Soviet Union following the end of World War II. Another term that you might hear is the Iron Curtain, and this refers to the Free West being split from the communist-ruled East. The way that they would put this is the free world versus the communist world. Britain had to step back following the end of World War II. They'd experienced a mass amount of devastation that the United States didn't experience because of the removal from each theater of war. And Truman in the United States filled in this gap for the superpower and said that they were fighting for freedom and for defense against communism. And part of that had to do with propping up what were considered to be other countries within the free world, again, following the war. In 1947, the CIA was created. Their main purpose was to gather intelligence and perform secret military missions abroad. This is part of this intention to contain communism and to rebuild up the so-called free world. Truman and the United States government portrayed the U.S. as this sort of bastion of freedom versus the stranglehold of the communist government in the Soviet Union. There continued to be levels of hypocrisy that we talked about that had been pointed out during World War II, and there was discrimination on many different levels, and we, as a nation, wanted to portray this sort of ultimate sense of freedom as contrast to the communist way of governing. Part of the way that the United States dealt with rebuilding the so-called free world was through the Marshall Plan. So this was named for Secretary of State George C. Marshall. I know, it's amazing that they came up with the name, the Marshall Plan, from that. Very creative in their naming. And this plan was unveiled in 1947, and it was meant to invest in order to help Europe recover physically so that communism wouldn't spread to desperate parts of the continent. So if people had to exist in ruin and had to continue to starve, they figured that people would attach to whichever government came and so that they could end this for them. They'd seen that going into World War II. Germany had been experiencing deep depression like most of the world, but they had a special attachment with the Versailles Treaty, which had led to a discouraging, demoralizing viewpoint from most of the citizens. So they were ready to turn towards somebody who said that they were going to be able to fix it. And that happened to be the Nazi Party in that case. So they didn't want to see this sort of thing repeated. So the idea was that they could promote this plan and not call it necessarily a plan that was anti-communist, but instead that it was against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. So they were trying to allay people's fears and do away with poverty and hunger and desperation in these spots so that the communist governments couldn't come in and try to fix it. And while Western Europe did indeed improve under the Marshall Plan, Eastern Europe did not have the same sort of success and did eventually fall under Soviet rule. And this created financial and social divides between Eastern and Western Europe. East and West Germany existed. These were separate nations, and they were so until 1991. And the Allies and the Soviets, so the Allies meaning the free world, so they called it, and the Soviets actually split Berlin even and used a different currency in each zone. So they tried to make a very stark divide and make it very clear who is in charge of which particular place. As you might imagine, Japan also needed this sort of plan to recover. And there was a push for Japanese reconstruction, and General Douglas MacArthur actually served as the supreme commander in Japan until 1948. And in 1948, Japan adopted a democratic constitution, and that was in place of the empire which had existed before. So with this requirement that Japan have an unconditional surrender, this meant that the United States was militarily in charge of the country until they set up their own constitution, which was obviously approved by the United States at that point too. What this new constitution did was expand the right to vote to women, even though that was quite controversial in Japan at the time. And Japan was also forced to renounce warfare as an option, and they were required to severely diminish the size of their armed forces. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background now that we're all in quarantine. My dog is 2 because her daycare shut down. So that's nice of her to participate. And the United States was heavily invested in Japan and the recovery because they were particularly worried that a communist push into the country would take down this potential for a democratic ally in East Asia, which they desperately needed at that point. NATO was also formed within this time frame, and they partly in response to the use of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union tested their own atomic bomb in 1949, so just a couple years after the United States had used theirs during war. And it was at this point that it really became a reality that 2 different nations, the most powerful 2 nations at the time, had access to the deadliest weapon known at the time. And it caused many different countries to have fears that they should either create their own bomb or at least team up with those who did have them. And there was there was this sort of precarious peace between people, because there was this fear that if one person let off one bomb, then the other nation would let off another one, and that millions and millions and millions of people would die as a result. So in order to kind of look over this peace process and sort of take care of it and cultivate it, the United States, Canada, and 10 European nations joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the purpose of them coming together was to pledge mutual defense of one another against the Soviet Union. So this would be how all of these countries could potentially get dragged into a hot war or an active war if the Soviet Union was to attack any one of those nations. And this same sort of alliance was created in Eastern Europe under the Warsaw Pact of 1955. So there are these different groups that are pledged to take care of one another in case one of the superpowers attacks the other. So communism was the big threat, and the key word that people kept talking about during this time. And the basic idea is that a communist society is one in which all of the wealth is owned collectively and all resources are shared. This is the theory. It's also meant to be egalitarian, meaning that people are equal. And it doesn't always end up panning out that way in real life, as you might imagine. Clearly, some parts of that sound great to some people, that there wouldn't be anyone left wanting. There wouldn't be anyone who was lower than anybody else. But it does not, it has not panned out that way at any point in human history on a large scale. So in 1949, Mao Zedong, the Communist Party leader in China, won the Chinese Civil War, and the West considered this to be the loss of China at that point. The Chinese nation turned into the People's Republic of China, and Chinese citizens experienced a lot of political strife following the Chinese Civil War, and there continues to be a level of resentment within China. And there was a concern that if China would fall, if other nations were close enough to the Soviet Union, that there would be more and more and more communist spread. And in 1950, the National Security Council made permanent the military buildup to fight communism. So there had been a military buildup during the war, and then there was a letdown in the numbers of people who were involved in the military. But the standing armies became much bigger after this point in order to help fight communism, which they believed would take much longer than a regular war. The Korean War is one of these proxy wars that the United States and the Soviet Union ended up being involved in. So Korea was divided after Japanese occupation during World War II. And North Korea fell under Soviet communist rule, and South Korea remains an ally of the United States even today. And they had an anti-communist but not entirely democratic government. So there were cases in which one country or the other would partner with a nation that did not have a similar political belief, but if they, it's sort of that theory of an enemy is my friend. So in June of 1950, South Korea was invaded by the North, the communist-ruled North, in order to attempt to reunify the whole nation under communism. And Truman convinced the UN Security Council to approve military action in order to counteract this. And in September of 1950, General MacArthur's troops invaded North Korea. There was a sense that the United States had this great military might. They hadn't lost before in any major war, and that they certainly wouldn't lose in this small space. So they went in. I do suggest, if you're interested, there are many good documentaries about the Korean War. It's sort of this war that people don't talk about. I think we talked a little bit about it before, but this is sort of the turning point where there was no clear winner. And with that, it means that the United States was certainly not a clear winner also. So there were many different battles throughout the country, movement in favor of the United States, where it looked like it might turn for them, and movement in favor of the North Korean government as well. And eventually this led to a stalemate, and there was sort of this holding pattern at the infamous 38th parallel, and that's approximately the latitude that divides North and South Korea. And there was an armistice called 3 years after the beginning of the war, 1953, which stopped the active fighting, but there was never a treaty that officially ended the war. And we can still see the effects of the way that this war ended even today. North and South Korea still have some active firefight now and again, and it's been this really precarious truce situation, and many people believe that this would restart both in North and South Korea, as well as in the United States. Throughout the Korean War, about 33,000 American soldiers were killed, about 1 million Korean soldiers died, and 2 million Korean civilians died, as well as hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers as well. So this war ends up not being discussed because of the treaty situation, and it sort of didn't really stand out for a lot of people. And it's also placed right in between World War II, and eventually we'll be talking about the Vietnam War. And both of those have received a lot of attention. So this one seems smaller to people in comparison with those two. So here's a map that you could go back and look at if you wanted to. It's just the different phases of the Korean War. So it's these, you can see the different movements of the UN forces into the communist-controlled peninsula, and then getting pushed back, and then eventually the armistice line. And DMZ means demilitarized zone. So this is still in effect today, where there's this sort of gap in between the two nations. So what goes along with all of this, with the entire world in flux and sort of on edge, is there were a lot of colonial independence movements that began popping up in response to European nations not being particularly strong following the end of World War II. Many nations who began to request their independence from different European colonial governments used the language of the United States Declaration of Independence in order to announce their cause. The document of the Declaration of Independence has been particularly inspirational for other nations throughout time, and they've used it to decry the interest in basic human rights and for freedom and self-determination. And whether those were lived out in any of those places is different from the stated intention when evoking the Declaration of Independence. And this decolonization effort and return of the power to the people was favored by most Democrats in the United States, and was also favored by African American leaders. And part of the reason that people would defend these decolonization efforts was that they were saying that the free world should be just that. It should be free. And if one side wasn't willing to extend that freedom to another, the other side, the other superpower, may very well attempt to take over. And the United States partnered with a lot of those nations in their request for freedom and decolonization, because they were hoping that they would not become involved with the Communist Party. A lot of words get used over and over again and have different meanings when they're brought up. Freedom is one of them, but totalitarianism is sort of timely, especially following World War II. So the basic definition of totalitarianism is ideologically driven states that sought to subdue all of civil society, including churches, unions, and other voluntary organizations. So what they essentially want to do is have complete control, to have a dictator, typically, and to have this sense that those in charge would be able to control all aspects of a person's life. So you could think about Nazi Germany, that's a totalitarian regime. And Hollywood wanted to sort of help draw this difference between freedom and totalitarianism. So they worked on this cultural censorship model to make the US look even better than it was, and to make communism look like pure evil. And everything that Moscow did at this point was categorized as evil and against freedom. There was no in between. It was very black and white. And the word socialism was invoked during these times as well, in order to equate all socialist policies as evil as well. So this continues to encourage people not to discuss socialized medicine, for example, like many other European nations had at that point. The United States was still, and remains, without it at any official level. Truman proposed a national health insurance, and the AMA again ended up fighting this off and scaring people with the concept of socialism, which was equated to communism, which was then equated to evil. So there was a sense of using fear to maintain this idealism that the United States wanted to portray. The Nuremberg took place at the beginning of this time frame following World War II, and this is when Nazi leaders were put on trial and sentenced. And in 1948, the UN General Assembly was created a commission led by Eleanor Roosevelt, which came up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the UN believed that the following basic ideas were essential to human rights: the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection against an arbitrary government, a decent standard of living, health care, and education. There's a link here, and I'll include a PDF copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in case you want to read it. It's an 8-page copy. But while all of that was well and good. It did not have an enforcement mechanism. So it was a declaration. It was something for people to look at and to model potentially their new governments on, following decolonization and following the rebuilding during this time frame. But there was no enforcement mechanism, so there was no attempt to have a sort of international police force that would enforce these rules. The United States and the Soviet Union were part of the reason that there wasn't this international police force, as they both denied any outside authority over their national laws and affairs. This continues to this day. The United States is not part of the International Criminal Court. There are very few nations who are not part of that, but the United States is one of them, and the reason behind that is the United States does not want to submit to any other authority. Also, notably, in 1948, genocide became a crime that could be punishable. It wasn't legally a crime in itself before this point, and this is when the term became solidified in the law. So there was a lot to deal with on the international stage, but it doesn't change the fact that there was also a lot to deal with at home. So Truman instituted what he called the Fair Deal in September of 1945, and the basics of this were that it was meant to improve the social safety net, raise the standard of living, increase the minimum wage, create a national health insurance, pump up public housing, and increase Social Security and aid to education. Part of the reason that all of these programs were looking at being expanded is that there were still about 12 million men who were in uniform as of August 1945, and there had to be a plan to bring these forces home and to provide them with what they needed. And the divorce rate doubled following the war, and part of it had to do with couples having been separated physically for years, and it also had to do with young men coming back from war as changed people, as you might imagine, having spent a great deal of time fighting in an active war. That would change a person, and some people found that their relationships could not survive. So the divorce rate doubled following the war. And part of what happened when these men returned from the war front is that they needed jobs. And what that meant is that many women, about 2 million women, were pushed out of their jobs in order to accommodate for the return of these men. And part of the reasoning for that was still that men made much more money than women did, and they believed that if one or the other was supposed to be working out of the household, it should be the male. But that didn't mean that every woman who lost her job was someone's wife either. Many of these women were working because they needed money. They had been widowed, some of them were single on their own. There were many women who were removed from their jobs in order to allow men to come in and then had no income. As always, there continued to be labor uprisings, and in 1946 there was this another wave of protests that sort of moved across the nation. Operation Dixie was backed by the CIO and the AFL, remember those umbrella organizations, and what they were doing was attempting to bring unionization in a big way to the South. And more than 200 organizers entered the region, entered the Deep South, in order to try to unite textile, steel, and agricultural workers underneath these umbrella organizations in order to demand their rights together, so have a much larger voice if more people were involved. There were mass walkouts and demanding wage increases so that people could more actively participate in this new consumer economy that they'd come home to. And this had really come to life during the war because it was the end of the Depression era. So people wanted to be able to spend, they wanted to be able to consume. And in order to do that, you needed to make an appropriate wage in order to have discretionary spending money. There was a particularly large walkout of steelworkers where about 750,000 walked out in protest all at once in different spots in the nation. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947, so the year after this sort of wave of large protests across the nation. And this was passed over President Truman's veto. So there was a 2/3 majority to undo his veto. And what it essentially did was reverse the gains that had been made by organized labor up until that point. And it allowed for the president to suspend strikes with an 80-day cooling off period and outlawed the closed shop. So it outlawed having to be a member of a union to work in a particular place. It also demanded that somebody take an oath that they were not a communist. So that sort of idea started to spread to a bunch of different sectors at this point, where people had to take an oath and swear, typically on the Bible, that they were not a communist and that they had no relationship to the Communist Party. There's a continuation among African Americans of requesting that their own rights be expanded as well. And from 1945 to 1951, there were 11 states that established fair employment, and there were many cities that passed anti-discrimination laws regarding public places and employment. So some of these efforts were at the local level, but there were state attempts to deal with discrimination in employment. By the 1950s, there were some improvements in voting conditions, depending on the region or the state, and there were continued to be fewer and fewer lynchings. And still, even with this expansion of voting rights and the decline in the number of lynchings throughout the country, the majority of African Americans still lived in outwardly discriminatory communities and had to deal with all of the fear that came with that. In 1947, Jackie Robinson was the first to integrate baseball, and he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers. And when he was in the Army, he had actually been tried and acquitted for not having moved to the back of a bus when a white passenger boarded. So we talked before, when we discussed World War II, about African American soldiers being asked to move out of the way, even for Nazi prisoners of war. So he had been in trouble for that prior to the end of the war. And by integrating baseball, there was a lot of pushback from people who weren't ready to see this happen, but it also gave a lot of people hope that the nation would be able to move forward together. In October of 1947, the Commission on Civil Rights published a document called To Secure These Rights. And what it did was discuss the situation of racial inequality within the United States. So there was this attempt to look at the way that African Americans specifically had been blocked from participating in democracy. and it called on the federal government to ensure desegregation in public areas. Truman tried to pass some laws related to this in 1948, and tried to make the Civil Rights Commission permanent, tried to make federal laws against lynching and poll taxes, and also tried to take action to secure fair job and educational opportunities. Now, not all of these things succeeded right away, but there was an attempt to start to deal with the issues that had been called out as hypocrisy during World War II. And the Korean War was actually the first integrated army in the United States since the Revolutionary War. So this was the first time that there had been integrated units on purpose since the Revolutionary War. And as is ever present, there were political arguments that were happening that touched all of these different areas. So the Southern Democrats were particularly bothered by the idea of moving forward with expansion of civil rights, and part of that had to do with it disrupting the balance of power in the Deep South. So there were a lot of African Americans still living in the Deep South, and if rights were expanded and equalized, it would mean a drastic shift in legal and social interactions. Governor Strom Thurmond ran for president under the States' Rights Democratic Party, which actually maintained a platform of racial segregation. So the idea was to continue segregation in his party. His opposition was Vice President Henry Wallace, who was running in the Progressive Party, as well as Truman in the Democratic Party. And the Progressive platform was focused on this expansion of social programs and the end of racial segregation. So what they wanted was to expand those programs like housing, aid to the poor, aid to the elderly, and healthcare, and at the same time deal with the end of racial segregation in public. And there were also those who were interested in having international control over nuclear weapons and finding some sort of peace deal with the Soviet Union so that there wouldn't always be this potential for catastrophe hanging over everyone's heads. That, of course, did not happen, and there was a continuance of this anti-communist crusade. The national government was interested in using national security as a cover for harsh governmental actions, and part of this, which is not necessarily a harsh action but is sort of extreme, is the creation of the highway system. But there was also aid to higher education, and the idea with giving money to higher education was that they were hoping that the technology would increase throughout the Cold War, and if the technology could increase, then the United States would have the upper hand, and it would really solidify this military-industrial educational complex. Refugees from communism did not have a limit for their quota, as many could enter the United States, while other forms of refugees still had quotas. So there was this special interest in bringing people out of communism and allowing them to come live in the United States. And the U.S. had such a mark on its reputation with Jim Crow continuing, and the international community was still confused about how these two things could coexist, how the United States could both be interested in expanding rights to people and also so interested in maintaining this separation of races within its own nation. So there were these questions of loyalty, and if anyone was linked to communism in any way, they were considered to be the enemy of freedom. And there were tangential relationships that people would draw up about people's relationships to a communist party. You have likely heard the term McCarthyism, which is named for Joseph McCarthy. But this sort of outlives his time in power, this concept that people sort of attach to. One group that was particularly hard hit during this time was the LGBT community, and they call this not the Red Scare, but the Lavender Scare. And this is when thousands of LGBT government employees were fired from their jobs with the acknowledgement that this was the reason for firing them. The government suspected that people who identified as LGBT may have been more susceptible to blackmail in an attempt to cover up their private lives. It was not socially acceptable in most cases at this point in time to stray from cis hetero relationships. And there is a film that it doesn't seem like I can play while I'm recording the lecture, but I will post that separately so that you can watch a clip of this. But it's a clip of somebody who was in government at this time and who had an experience with the Lavender Scare. So please do watch that. It will be posted along with this lecture. There were spy trials that took place as well. So there was this great interest in spies, and the editor of Time magazine, Whittaker Chambers, gave testimony for HUAC, the House Un-American Committee, House Un-American Activities Committee, excuse me. And he stated that in the 1930s, Alger Hiss, who was State Department official, gave him, Chambers, government documents to pass along to Soviet agents. And this meant that Hiss was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And you can see a progression in governmental importance for Richard Nixon here. And this was actually how he made a name for himself as the main pursuer of this case. But one of the most infamous execution cases came when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed. They were working class Jewish communists from New York, and they were accused mainly by her brother, Ethel's brother, of passing along secrets of the atomic bomb to the Soviets. And years later, there's actually proof that Julian was likely involved to some degree, but by no means gave the Soviets enough information for them to have created the bomb, although he may have sped up their progress. But Ethel, his wife, there's still no actual evidence against her, but they were both executed in the face of international protest. I'm going to see if I can get this one to play.
Early 1950, that the British were able to arrest Klaus Fuchs.
Fuchs was considered brilliant. I mean, he was considered to have a virtually photographic memory, a brilliant theoretical and mathematical physicist, and they didn't have any clue that he was actually giving everything that he looked at to the Soviet Union.
Klaus Fuchs is the first link in a chain leading to one of the biggest spy scandals in American history.
Fuchs identifies a man who served as his go-between with the Russians, named David Greenglass. David Greenglass explains that he was recruited for spying by his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg.
Julius Rosenberg has a small machine shop in the Bronx. He's arrested in July 1950. His wife Ethel, David Greenglass's sister, a month later. Both are members of the Communist Party. Court filings present them as super spies. They refuse to talk, pleading the fifth instead. They have little chance, especially when Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, testifies against them. Both are found guilty and sentenced to death.
There were multiple attempts to plead for pardoning or clemency or commutation of sentencing. All of this was rejected. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are executed in Sing Sing prison by electric chair.
Debate about their guilt or innocence lasts for decades. Until 1995, when previously classified documents revealed the prosecution knew a lot more than ever came out in court.
During World War II, the United States intercepted a large number of Soviet communications, and they spent an immense amount of time to try and crack these codes.
They were from a spy program codenamed Venona.
We now know, we've been able to get access to those decrypted communications, and it's pretty clear that Julius Rosenberg is a spy.
Spies are never referred to by name in Soviet communications.
Julius had a fancy code name because he was an important person. His code name was Antenna.
Ethel was a different story.
Ethel is referred to in the files as Ethel. That's a sign that she isn't a spy. That's a sign that she's the wife of a spy or something like that. It's very minor.
Information from the Venona papers could have convicted Julius, but exonerated Ethel.
Here's the thing, though. The United States does not want the Soviet Union to know that it has cracked its codes, so it will never use that evidence in court.
A government secret deemed so important, Ethel Rosenberg lost her life to ensure it wasn't divulged.
So you can see how that would be a controversial use of the justice system. People still discuss this to this day, and about whether or not this was the right thing to do.
Early 1950.
Whoops.
That.
Sorry about that. So you can see how fear clearly took over and led to extreme decisions. So there were many state and local committees like HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, that demanded loyalty oaths from people like teachers, pharmacists, and other professionals who interacted with the public. There were many books that were heavily censored or outright banned, like Robin Hood was banned for being a story about taking from the rich and giving to the poor, and this sort of redistribution of wealth. And the fear that was instilled in people was used to hold up other policies like FBI expansion and businesses dismantling unions and religious enforcement of sexuality and gender roles. So a lot of these things had this backdrop as being put into place in order to go against communism and to go against the Soviet Union and to ensure the American way of living. And in 1954, the military in the United States actually invaded Mexican-American neighborhoods under what they called Operation Wetback, which is a derogatory term against Latino people. And they deported about 1 million people within 1 year. So we talked about the deportations of Mexican Americans during the Depression, and this is another instance of this sort of mass deportation. Even with all of this in mind, the United States is the only developed nation not to provide basics like healthcare and education beyond high school as a guarantee. So, because of this great fear of the socialist model or the communist model, there was a turn away from these sorts of programs. And on top of all of this, we have the beginning of the civil rights movement. So there's this affluent society that was on the rise for many, and this sort of skipped over different populations, especially African Americans. And racial inequality in this way had played into the Russians' hands, and it was difficult to criticize the United States from inside during this time because of the cracking down of the government on these essential means for expressing oneself, or these means for achieving freedom of speech. And there remained these contradictions, like segregation in schools, segregation in housing, and segregation in job opportunities. And this is another point in which white Americans moved up further in the ranks and African Americans remained stymied because of this more compromised position. And this feeds into the escalation of the civil rights movement. And that's what we'll be talking about in the next lecture.